2 men saved lives under fire that day. Only one followed the rules. Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam, July 14th, 1968. Corpsman 3rd Class. James Harlan crouched in mud thick as motor oil, his hands slick with blood that wasn't his own. Lance Corporal Mike Torres gasped beside him, chest wound, sucking air with each breath. 20 meters away, PFC Danny Reeves screamed. Femoral artery severed, blood pulsing between Harlan's fingers despite the tourniquet he'd applied exactly as trained. Harlan had done everything right. Chest seal applied within 30 seconds. Tourniquet positioned 2 inches above the wound. Morphine administered. Radio call for medevac transmitted with grid coordinates and casualty count. Now came the hardest part of combat medicine. Waiting. Through the smoke and the staccato crack of AK-47 fire, Harlan saw movement. 40 meters across the clearing, a figure moved between bodies. Not running, working. The man wore black pajamas and a chest rig that looked assembled from canvas scraps. A Vietnamese medic. Enemy. But he wasn't fighting, he was saving lives. Harlan watched, transfixed, as the medic dropped beside a wounded fighter. No radio. No call for extraction. Just hands moving with surgical precision. The medic pulled something from his kit. Not a pressure bandage. Vines. He was making a tourniquet from jungle vines. It shouldn't work, Harlan thought. That's not protocol. But it did work. The bleeding stopped. The medic moved to the next casualty. Then the next. Harlan counted 6 wounded men in that clearing. The Vietnamese medic worked under direct fire, bullets kicking up dirt around him, and he didn't stop. He used what looked like gunpowder to cauterize a wound. He packed another injury with leaves. Leaves. Harlan had IV fluids, antibiotics, sterile bandages. This man had vines and plants. 18 minutes after Harlan first saw him, the Vietnamese medic and his comrades carried all 6 wounded fighters into the jungle. All 6 alive. All 6 stabilized. Harlan's medevac arrived 34 minutes after his initial call. Standard response time. Acceptable by every military metric. Torres died 3 minutes before the helicopter landed. Tension pneumothorax. Harlan had the needle to decompress the chest. He'd been trained on the procedure, but protocol required radio approval from a flight surgeon before performing it. He'd followed the rules. Reeves died as they loaded him onto the helicopter. Blood loss. The tourniquet had worked exactly as designed, but 34 minutes was too long. Harlan sat in the helicopter, hands still covered in their blood, and asked himself a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I did everything right. Everything by the book. So why are they dead and his are alive? That question would change everything. 14 months earlier, Harlan had been a different man. Confident. Proud. Certain. He'd graduated from Naval Hospital Corps School in Great Lakes, Illinois, after 14 weeks of intensive medical training. Top 15% of his class. He'd volunteered for Field Medical Service School at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. 8 more weeks learning combat medicine alongside Marine infantry units. He'd learned to start IVs while wearing gas masks. He'd practiced triage on simulated casualties while instructors fired blanks overhead. He'd memorized protocols for every conceivable battlefield injury. The instructors had been clear. American combat medicine was the best in the world. The golden hour concept. Stabilize and evacuate within 60 minutes. That was the key to survival. Harlan had the best equipment available. Morphine syrettes, pressure bandages, chest seals, IV fluids, a radio that could summon a helicopter with a surgical team in minutes. He'd been taught that following protocol saved lives. Improvisation killed people. His first 3 months in Vietnam had confirmed everything he'd learned. March through June of 1968, Harlan served with 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. He'd treated gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, heat casualties. He'd called in medevacs that arrived in 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes. Marines lived because the system worked, because American medicine was superior, because Harlan followed his training. He'd heard stories about Viet Cong medics. Rumors, really. Marines would mention them in passing. Talk about finding enemy aid stations in tunnel complexes. crude surgical tools, herbal medicines. Harlan had dismissed it, primitive medicine, desperation tactics, nothing compared to American capabilities. One Marine had told him about a village medic who'd saved his life when he'd gotten separated from his unit. The old man had used some kind of plant paste on an infected wound when Harlan's antibiotics had run out. The infection cleared. Harlan had called it luck. Coincidence. The antibiotics had probably just needed more time to work. A senior corpsman, a veteran of 2 tours, had pulled Harlan aside one night. "The VC medics are tougher than you think, Doc. They've been doing this a lot longer than us. Don't underestimate them." Harlan had nodded politely, but he hadn't believed it. How could someone with inferior equipment and training be tougher than a United States Navy corpsman? July 14th taught him the answer. They were tougher because they had to be. What Harlan didn't know, what his training had never covered, was the history he was fighting against. The Vietnamese had been at war for 22 years by the time Harlan arrived in country. The First Indochina War against the French had lasted from 1946 to 1954. 8 years of combat. 8 years of learning to treat battlefield casualties with whatever materials the jungle provided. The French had helicopters too. They'd had modern medicine too. They'd lost anyway. After the French withdrawal, the country had split, north and south, but the fighting never stopped. By 1968, Vietnamese medics had 14 additional years of continuous combat experience. They'd treated casualties in conditions that would have been unthinkable to American military planners. No expectation of evacuation, no resupply, no radio contact with higher medical authority, just knowledge, improvisation, and courage. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army Medical Corps drew from centuries of traditional medicine, herbal remedies that predated Western pharmaceuticals, acupuncture and acupressure techniques for pain management, natural antiseptics derived from plants that grew in the jungle around them. They'd learned which leaves could stop bleeding, which roots could fight infection, which techniques could save a life when modern equipment wasn't available. Their training philosophy was fundamentally different from American doctrine. Where Harlan had been taught to stabilize and evacuate, Vietnamese medics were taught to treat and move. They couldn't wait for helicopters. They had to save lives with what they carried and what they could find. Every medic was trained to perform procedures that American corpsmen would consider beyond their scope. Field amputations, emergency tracheotomies, chest decompressions with sharpened bamboo. They did these things not because they wanted to, but because no one else would arrive to do them. The tactical difference was stark. American combat medicine assumed a functioning evacuation chain, radio contact, air superiority, landing zones, medical facilities within helicopter range. The entire system was built on the assumption that a wounded soldier could be moved from point of injury to surgical care within the golden hour. Vietnamese combat medicine assumed none of that. Their medics expected to work alone. They expected to be cut off from support. They expected to treat casualties and then carry them for miles through jungle to reach any kind of medical facility. So they developed techniques that worked in those conditions. Tourniquets from parachute cord, vines, even rifle slings, antiseptics from betel leaves, turmeric, honey, cauterization with gunpowder or heated metal, IV fluid substitutes from coconut water, sutures from plant fibers, splints from bamboo, pain management through acupressure points when morphine wasn't available. American military intelligence had documented some of this. Captured medical manuals showed sophisticated understanding of trauma care. Survival rates among wounded VC fighters who reached aid stations shocked analysts, who'd assumed primitive conditions meant primitive care. But this information rarely reached the corpsmen in the field. Harlan had never seen those intelligence reports. He'd never been told that the enemy medics might have something to teach him. The assumption of American superiority was so deeply embedded that questioning it seemed almost treasonous. Better equipment must mean better outcomes. More training must mean more capability. The idea that someone with less of both could achieve better results under the same conditions didn't fit the narrative, so it was ignored. Harlan couldn't ignore it anymore. He'd watched it happen. 6 lives saved versus 2 lives lost. Same battlefield, same conditions, different approach. The Vietnamese medic had known something Harlan didn't, had been willing to do things Harlan's training said were wrong, and those 6 men had lived because of it. Back at Firebase Vandegrift, Harlan sat in his hooch and tried to write the casualty reports. Cause of death for Torres, killed in action, combat wounds. Cause of death for Reeves, killed in action, combat wounds. The forms didn't have a box for died waiting for a system that was too slow. They didn't have a box for corpsman followed protocol while enemy medics saved 6 men in the same amount of time. Harlan's hands shook as he wrote. Not from fear, from rage. Rage at himself. Rage at his training. Rage at a system that had convinced him following rules was more important than saving lives. The questions wouldn't stop. Why didn't I needle decompress Torres's chest? Because protocol required radio approval from a flight surgeon. But Torres died before that approval came. The needle was in Harlan's kit. He knew the procedure. He'd practiced it dozens of times in training. But he'd been taught to wait for authorization, so he'd waited. And Torres had died. Why didn't the tourniquet save Reeves? It did work. The bleeding stopped. But 34 minutes was too long. The human body can only survive so much blood loss. If the medevac had arrived in 15 minutes, Reeves would have lived. But Harlan couldn't control helicopter response times. He could only control what he did in those 34 minutes. And what he'd done was wait. How did that Vietnamese medic save 6 men? That was the question that burned brightest. Harlan replayed the scene in his mind. The vines used as tourniquets, the gunpowder cauterization, the plant poultices. None of it was in any American medical manual. None of it should have worked. But it had worked. Harlan had watched it work. He couldn't discuss these doubts with his fellow corpsmen. They'd see it as weakness, disloyalty. Second-guessing yourself in combat got people killed. You had to trust your training, trust the system. Doubt was dangerous. The Marines in his unit noticed something was wrong. Doc seemed distracted, distant. He still did his job, still treated casualties, still called in medevacs, but something had changed. The confidence was gone. Harlan started a notebook. He didn't tell anyone about it. Late at night, by flashlight, he sketched what he'd seen. The Vietnamese medics' techniques, the improvised tourniquets, the cauterization method. He wrote questions. Could plant-based antiseptics actually work? What was the survival rate for casualties treated with improvised techniques versus standard protocol? How long had Vietnamese medics been developing these methods? He started paying attention to things he'd ignored before. Local villagers who treated injuries with herbal remedies. ARVN soldiers who used techniques different from American doctrine. Captured enemy medical supplies that looked crude but effective. He interviewed villagers through interpreters, asking about traditional medicine. Which plants stopped bleeding? Which prevented infection? The old women knew. They'd been treating wounds since before the Americans arrived. Since before the French arrived. 3 weeks after Torres and Reeves died, Harlan tried to discuss his observations with his senior medical officer, Lieutenant Commander Richard Paulson, Navy Medical Corps. Career officer, 20 years in. Paulson listened to Harlan's report with increasing irritation. Corpsman, you did your job. The system works. Don't second-guess yourself. Sir, I'm not second-guessing. I'm asking if the system is fast enough for jungle warfare. That Vietnamese medic saved 6 men in 18 minutes. My medevac took 34 minutes. That's the difference between life and death. Paulson's face hardened. You witnessed one incident under unverified conditions. You don't know if those 6 men actually survived. You don't know what their injuries were. You're comparing apples to oranges. Sir, I know what I saw. He used improvised techniques that aren't in our protocols. And they worked. Corpsman Harlan, we have the best combat medicine in the world. Our protocols are based on decades of research and experience. Don't confuse luck with skill. That medic got lucky. You followed proper procedure. Sometimes casualties die despite proper treatment. That's war. But sir, what if we could learn from their techniques? What if there are procedures we could use when evacuation is delayed? Paulson stood up. The meeting was over. We don't learn from the enemy, Corpsman. We defeat them. You're dismissed. Harlan left the office knowing he'd made a mistake. He'd challenged the system, questioned the doctrine. That wasn't how junior enlisted men advanced their careers. But he couldn't let it go. Torres and Reeves deserved better than that's war. He started carrying improvised supplies, paracord that could be used as tourniquets, samples of plants that local villagers said had medicinal properties. His fellow corpsmen noticed. Going native, Doc? They meant it as a joke, but there was an edge to it, an implication. Don't be different. Don't question. Do your job. Harlan's internal conflict grew. He'd been trained to trust the system, to follow protocol, to believe that American medicine was superior. But he'd seen evidence that contradicted all of that. He'd watched an enemy medic achieve better results with worse equipment. That shouldn't be possible, but it had happened. The conflict came to a head on August 3, 1968. Another patrol, another ambush. A Marine took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. Traumatic amputation of the lower left leg, massive arterial bleeding. Harlan applied a tourniquet, called for medevac, administered morphine, standard protocol. But the bleeding wouldn't stop completely. The tourniquet had slowed it, but blood still pulsed from the wound. The Marine was going into shock. Harlan checked his watch. Medevac estimated time of arrival, 40 minutes. The Marine wouldn't last 40 minutes. Harlan remembered the Vietnamese medic, remembered the cauterization. Gunpowder applied to the wound, ignited, sealing the blood vessels through heat. It was barbaric. It wasn't sterile. It would cause additional tissue damage. It violated every principle of modern medicine. It might save this Marine's life. Harlan made his decision. He took a small amount of gunpowder from a damaged ammunition cartridge, applied it to the bleeding wound, ignited it with a match. The Marine screamed. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. But the bleeding stopped, completely stopped. The Marine survived the 40-minute wait, survived the helicopter ride, survived surgery at the field hospital. He lost his leg, but he lived. Harlan had saved his life by violating protocol. He also earned a formal reprimand. Lieutenant Commander Paulson called him in the next day. Corpsman Harlan, you performed an unauthorized medical procedure on a wounded Marine. You used a technique that is not approved by Navy medical doctrine. You endangered that Marine's life. Sir, I saved his life. He was bleeding out. The tourniquet wasn't enough. He wouldn't have survived the medevac wait. You got lucky. That procedure could have caused infection, additional tissue damage, or accelerated shock. You exceeded your scope of practice. Sir, the Vietnamese medics use this technique regularly. It works. We are not Vietnamese medics. We are United States Navy corpsmen. We follow established protocols based on scientific medicine. What you did was reckless and dangerous. If you ever perform an unauthorized procedure again, I will recommend court-martial. Do you understand? Yes, sir. You're a good corpsman, Harlan. You have good instincts. But you need to trust your training. The system works. Follow the protocols. That's an order. Harlan left the office knowing the system wouldn't change from within. The institution was too invested in its own superiority. Admitting that enemy medics might have valuable techniques would mean admitting that American doctrine was incomplete. That was unacceptable. But Harlan couldn't stop. He'd seen too much. He knew too much. If the system wouldn't change, he'd find another way. He found an unlikely ally at Firebase Vandegrift. Australian Army Corporal Jack Morrison, attached to an advisory unit working with ARVN forces. Morrison had spent 6 months embedded with South Vietnamese medical units. He'd seen their techniques, learned from them. He didn't have the same institutional resistance that American military medicine did. Mate, the Vietnamese have been doing field medicine longer than our countries have existed, Morrison told Harlan over coffee one night. They've got techniques we've never thought of because we've never had to. We've always had helicopters and hospitals. They've had to make do. That breeds innovation. Morrison shared his own notebook. techniques he'd learned from ARVN medics, pressure point methods to slow bleeding without tourniquets, herbal antiseptics that actually worked, field triage philosophy that prioritized who could be saved rather than who was most severely wounded. It was different from American doctrine, but it was effective. Morrison arranged a meeting. ARVN Sergeant Nguyen Van Thieu, Medical Corps. 42 years old. He'd fought with French Union forces in the 1950s, had 18 years of combat medical experience. He'd seen more battlefield casualties than every American corpsman in Vietnam combined. Through an interpreter, Thieu taught Harlan things that weren't in any American manual. Acupressure points that could slow arterial bleeding, buying time for other interventions, plant-based antiseptics that prevented infection as effectively as antibiotics in many cases, betel leaf paste, honey dressings, turmeric powder, all of them available in the Vietnamese jungle, all of them effective. Thieu's triage philosophy was different. American medicine tries to save everyone. Vietnamese medicine saves who can be saved. Treat the savable first. Comfort the dying. Ignore the scratches. In combat, you must choose. Choose wrong and everyone dies. It was brutal. It was pragmatic. It was honest in a way American doctrine wasn't. American protocols assumed unlimited resources, unlimited time, unlimited evacuation capacity. Vietnamese protocols assumed none of that. They assumed you were alone, under fire, with limited supplies, and had to make impossible choices. Harlan realized his training had prepared him for ideal conditions. Radio contact, quick evacuation, sterile supplies. But jungle warfare rarely provided ideal conditions. Radios failed. Helicopters got delayed. Supplies ran out. The gap between doctrine and reality was killing Marines. He started testing improvised techniques on himself. Acupressure points, herbal antiseptics on minor cuts. He studied captured Viet Cong medical supplies. They looked crude, canvas bags instead of proper medical kits, bamboo splints instead of manufactured ones, plant-based medicines instead of pharmaceuticals. But they worked. They were designed for the conditions they'd be used in. American medical kits were designed for American conditions. They didn't always translate to Vietnamese jungle warfare. Harlan began compiling comprehensive documentation. He compared survival rates, his unit versus ARVN units versus estimated VC survival rates, based on intelligence reports. He analyzed evacuation time delays and their correlation with mortality. He photographed improvised medical supplies. He collected testimonials from Marines who'd survived using non-standard techniques. He wrote technical descriptions of Vietnamese medical procedures, explaining how they worked and why they might be valuable additions to American doctrine. The documentation grew to 47 pages. Charts, graphs, photographs, testimonials, medical analysis. It was thorough, it was professional, it was undeniable. Senior Chief Hospital Corpsman Michael Riley reviewed it. Riley was 42, a veteran of the Korean War. He'd served with Marine Raiders in World War II. He understood unconventional warfare in a way that younger officers didn't. "Doc, this is good work. Really good. But you know the Navy won't listen to a junior corpsman. They might listen to data, though. You need to submit this formally. Go through channels. Make them respond officially." "Senior Chief, this could end my career." "It could. But how many more Torres and Reeves are going to die if you don't try? You've got the evidence. You've got the analysis. Make them look at it. Make them justify why they won't change." Harlan knew Riley was right. He'd gone too far to stop now. In September 1968, he submitted his report to Navy Medical Command, Vietnam. Title: Adaptive Field Medicine Protocols for Prolonged Evacuation Scenarios. The report made specific recommendations. Train corpsmen in improvised tourniquet techniques using available materials. Authorize field needle decompression without radio approval in cases of tension pneumothorax. Include basic herbal antiseptics in medical kits for use when pharmaceuticals aren't available. Reduce doctrinal reliance on evacuation as primary treatment strategy. Establish cross-training programs with ARVN and allied medics to share techniques. The response came 3 weeks later. Harlan was summoned to Da Nang Naval Hospital. A review board had been convened. 3 Navy medical officers, Captain Theodore Harrison, Chief of Naval Medicine, Vietnam, Commander Patricia Wells, Head of Corpsman Training, Lieutenant Commander Paulson. The interrogation was professional, but hostile. Captain Harrison led. Corpsman Harlan, are you suggesting that our training is inadequate? No, sir. I'm suggesting it's incomplete for this specific combat environment. Commander Wells, you witnessed one enemy medic under unverified conditions and you're questioning decades of medical doctrine? Ma'am, I witnessed 6 men survive conditions that killed 2 of mine. I've since documented multiple instances where improvised techniques achieved better outcomes than standard protocol. That's not anecdotal. That's data. Lieutenant Commander Paulson, you violated protocol and endangered a Marine with unauthorized procedures. You're lucky he survived. Sir, that Marine is alive. Would he be alive if I'd followed protocol and waited 40 minutes for medevac? The question hung in the air. No one answered it. Captain Harrison, our system is based on scientific medicine, not folk remedies. We can't authorize corpsmen to experiment with unproven techniques. Sir, these techniques have been proven. The Vietnamese have been using them successfully for over 20 years. We're the ones experimenting by assuming our protocols work in all conditions. Commander Wells, if we authorize improvisation, we open ourselves to malpractice liability and inconsistent care quality. Ma'am, with respect, consistency doesn't matter if it's consistently too slow. Marines are dying waiting for a system that assumes conditions that don't exist in jungle warfare. Paulson, you're romanticizing the enemy and undermining confidence in our methods. Sir, I'm not romanticizing anyone. I'm trying to save Marines. I've presented evidence, survival statistics, evacuation time analysis, testimonials, technical descriptions. If the evidence is wrong, show me why. If it's right, why aren't we adapting? The board members exchanged glances. Harlan had put them in an impossible position. They couldn't refute his evidence without reviewing it thoroughly. They couldn't review it thoroughly without acknowledging he might be right. They couldn't acknowledge he might be right without admitting American doctrine was flawed. The verdict came 2 days later. Harlan's report was taken under advisement for future doctrinal review. He received an official commendation for dedication to medical excellence and innovative thinking. He was reassigned to the rear echelon medical facility at Da Nang Naval Hospital, effective immediately. It was a political solution. Acknowledge his work publicly while burying it bureaucratically. Remove him from field operations where he might continue to violate protocol. Give him a commendation to prevent him from claiming retaliation. File his report where it would never be implemented. Senior Chief Riley found Harlan the night before his transfer. Doc, you did the right thing. Sometimes that's all you can do. Plant the seed. Maybe it grows. Maybe it doesn't. But you tried. They're going to bury it, Senior Chief. Nothing's going to change. Maybe not today. Maybe not this year. But you documented it. It's in the system now. Someday, someone's going to read that report and realize you were right. That's how change happens in the military. Slowly. Too slowly. But it happens. Harlan spent the rest of his tour at Da Nang Naval Hospital. He treated casualties who'd already been evacuated. He trained new corpsmen arriving in country. He never returned to field operations, but he continued teaching improvised techniques informally. His notebooks circulated among corpsmen who were willing to learn. Some adopted his methods quietly. Some saved lives using techniques that weren't officially authorized. By 1970, several corpsmen reported successful use of improvised techniques. Field needle decompression without radio approval. Improvised tourniquets using paracord. Herbal antiseptics when antibiotics weren't available. MACV medical advisors noticed improved survival rates in certain units. They couldn't explain why. The official protocols hadn't changed, but the unofficial practices had. Informal cross-training with ARVN medics became more common. Australian and New Zealand medical personnel validated what Harlan had documented. The techniques worked. The Vietnamese had been right all along. American doctrine was incomplete, but official doctrine didn't change. Not during the war. The institutional resistance was too strong. Admitting that enemy medics had valuable techniques would mean admitting American superiority was a myth. That was politically unacceptable. Harlan returned to civilian life in 1973. He became a paramedic in Cleveland, Ohio. He applied the lessons he'd learned. Treat first, transport second. Don't wait for ideal conditions. Use what works, not what the manual says should work. He advocated for wilderness medicine training and EMS programs. He stayed in contact with Morrison and other Vietnam medics who'd learned the same lessons. The vindication came slowly. In the 1990s, the military developed Tactical Combat Casualty Care, the TCCC program. It emphasized immediate intervention over evacuation dependency. It authorized field procedures Harlan had advocated for 20 years earlier. Needle decompression without radio approval. Aggressive tourniquet use. Hemostatic agents to stop bleeding quickly. The doctrine had finally caught up to reality. Military medical historians rediscovered Harlan's 1968 report. They realized he'd been right. He was invited to speak at Navy Medical Corps training programs, to share his story, to explain what he'd learned from that Vietnamese medic whose name he'd never known. In 2005, at age 59, Harlan was interviewed for a military medical history project. The interviewer asked him to reflect on July 14th, 1968. I watched a man save 6 lives with vines and gunpowder while I lost 2 with the best equipment in the world. That moment taught me that medicine isn't about tools. It's about knowledge, adaptability, and courage. That Vietnamese medic had all 3. I had the tools, but I didn't have the wisdom to use them properly. The interviewer asked about the Vietnamese medic. I never learned his name. Don't know if he survived the war, probably didn't. The life expectancy for VC medics was measured in months, not years. But he was a better medic than I was that day, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. He taught me that respect for your enemy's skills isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's how you get better. About the institutional resistance. The Navy wasn't wrong to question me. I was a 22-year-old kid challenging decades of doctrine, but they were wrong to ignore the evidence. How many Marines died between 1968 and when they finally changed the protocols? That's the question that still keeps me up at night. How many Torres? How many Reeves? How many men died because we were too proud to learn from the enemy? Harlan visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. He found Torres and Reeves among the 58,000 names. He placed his old corpsman notebook at the base of the wall. A symbolic gesture. Passing knowledge to future generations, honoring the men he couldn't save by helping save others. The broader lesson transcended Vietnam. War teaches harsh lessons to those willing to learn. Pride and institutional inertia cost lives. The best warriors respect their enemy's skills because that respect makes them better. True courage isn't just facing enemy fire. It's facing your own failures and fighting to prevent others from repeating them. James Harlan never became famous, never received medals for his advocacy, never got official recognition for challenging a system that needed to change. But corpsmen today use techniques he fought to legitimize. They perform field procedures he documented in 1968. They save lives using lessons he learned from an enemy medic in a jungle clearing. That Vietnamese medic, whose name Harlan never learned, inadvertently saved countless American lives. By demonstrating superior technique under fire, he taught one corpsman to question everything. That questioning led to documentation. That documentation led to change. That change led to lives saved. 2 men worked under fire that day in Quang Tri Province. One followed the rules and lost 2 patients. One improvised with vines and gunpowder and saved 6. The lesson wasn't that rules are worthless. The lesson was that rules written for ideal conditions fail in real conditions. The lesson was that adaptability matters more than protocol. The lesson was that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, even from an enemy you never meet. Harlan carried that lesson for the rest of his life. He taught it to every paramedic he trained. He shared it with every medical student who asked about Vietnam. He wrote it in the margins of every protocol manual he reviewed. The lesson was simple. Medicine isn't about following rules. It's about saving lives. Sometimes those two things align. Sometimes they don't. When they don't, choose lives. That choice cost Harlan his field career in 1968. But it saved lives in the decades that followed. That's the trade he made. That's the trade he'd make again. Because on July 14th, 1968, in a jungle clearing in Quang Tri Province, a Vietnamese medic taught an American corpsman the most important lesson of his career. Excellence doesn't belong to one side. Courage doesn't wear one uniform. And the willingness to learn from anyone, even an enemy, is what separates good medics from great ones. James Harlan became a great medic the day he admitted someone else was better. If this story made you think differently about courage and learning, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you respect those who question to save lives. And comment below, what's a lesson you learned from an unexpected source? Your story matters.